Good morning, everyone. It is my privilege to be among you this morning. I've been hearing about Snowmass Chapel from all kinds of directions, and to have the privilege of sharing worship with you, and for the generosity of sharing the pulpit with me, I am so grateful. I want to thank some folks. This whole idea started with Charla. She took a course. One of her courses this winter was the spiritual foundations of fundraising. And she did a really good job in this course. But she said, why don't you come this summer and preach at Snowmass? And then the invitation came, and I'm just delighted. Your senior pastor and I share some geography together. When he was in Skaneateles, New York, I was still working at Syracuse University. And so we haven't had a chance to fully know those times when we may have been in the same room together, but it is fun to know that we shared that space together. And to Caroline, who's provided so many things, hospitality, and Charla, who opened her home, and some members of your stewardship team were with us last night as we shared conversation and a wonderful meal. It is just good to be with you, so thank you very much. So during my college summers, to raise money and for my expenses for the next year, I worked on farms in upstate New York. And there was this one particular farm that I worked on, and it was early in the season. I was just out of my semester, and I was anticipating a full summer of employment with this farmer. And he taught me how to drive a tractor, and it was planting season, and he taught me how to drive this huge tractor with this huge disc behind it. He had gone and plowed the fields before I got there, and then I was supposed to break the land down one more round. And one of the things about this job, though, and dragging this huge disc, was that I had to have my eye in front of me looking for deep stones that had been lifted by the frost over the winter. Stones that would interfere with planting, and there were a lot of stones in this field. And it was early morning, and the dew was heavy, had been heavy the night before, and what was going to be dusk by noon was slimy, yucky mud. And I'm going across that field early in the morning, and I'm having to get off the tractor every 10 feet, it felt like, and picking these heavy stones up out of the earth and digging around them sometimes, and sometimes putting a chain on them and dragging them out of the hole, and then lifting them into the stone box. And at the end, after one pass across and back, there was this large stone pile at the headlands of the field, and my job was to empty the stone box and throw them into the pile. I hated that job. I hated everything about it. And I wasn't exactly feeling the love of my boss either. He was one of those people that was exactly always on task and always worried and anxious about the next thing. And on one of my passes toward the end of my time on that field, here he comes in this truck, and I'm coming up to the edge of the field, and I'm about ready to unload more stones, and he gets out of his truck, and without even thinking, he starts ordering me to the next field and what I needed to do there and everything else. And then he saw me throw the stone on the pile. In an uncharacteristic fashion, he stopped, and his eyes softened. I had never seen this in him before. His eyes softened, his voice softened. And he said, my great-grandfather started that pile of stones. And all of a sudden, my whole attitude about that job shifted. All of a sudden, I realized that I was not just, it was not good enough for me to be self-absorbed in my personal misery. All of a sudden, I realized that I was working in a field that had been worked for generations. And I was working with something that was larger than myself and larger than my boss even. I was becoming aware that I was a part of something that was in a constant state of being created. And I was sharing in a legacy of honest labor and planting and harvest, year after year, food production, the gifts of the good earth, life itself. And I began to imagine how many people had been fed from that field. And as I got back on the tractor to finish that field, I thought of how many more would be fed from this work in the future. My boss, who had seemed to me as incapable of looking past the current problem that was always now, revealed to me that he had a sense for history and the flow of time, that underneath all of that hardened exterior was a sense of his work being part of a purposeful tradition and a sense of building a possibility for the future. I woke up and felt something. This morning we enter the world of stewardship. Stewardship is an all-inclusive view of the world, but so often, particularly I think in the church, it becomes synonymous with money and budgets and some kind of external expression of what is expected. Put all of that aside for a moment, and this morning, let's look within ourselves and not in isolation from each other, but to that place where we can explore our interior selves to see what we find there that is related to a deeper sense of stewardship. I love the story from Emmaus, and gospel scholars are fascinated. There's been a historic fascination with this text. But there's so much to plumb there. But for a moment, let's just go to the essence of it. The two are deeply absorbed in the events of Jerusalem, the crucifixion of Jesus. And they're just processing it with each other as they walked away from Jerusalem to Emmaus. A lot of the immediate followers of Jesus had locked themselves away out of fear, thinking they might be next to be crucified. And so there is great fear and anxiety and confusion, political, religious, all kinds of confusion running rampant through Jerusalem. And they're walking home to Emmaus, and they're talking to each other, and they're processing it. And of course, as it was just read, Jesus approaches them. What are you talking about? And they were aghast, and we heard all the narrative in the text. They were aghast at how he didn't know, how could you not know what was going on? But there's a wonderful line in that text that I'll pull your attention to. When they got to Emmaus, it was evening. And these two said to Jesus, unaware that it was him, "We strongly urge you to come in." Now, in the social norms of the day, hospitality was expected. It was normal for people to say, come on in, spend the night, and have food with us. And then the person could politely say, thank you. And so the hospitality code will have been honored, and the person would move on. But when you were strongly urged, that meant something about, this is a sign of the character of these two individuals. They strongly urged him to join them. And then you know the story. They brought out the bread. And Jesus took the bread, and he blessed the bread, and he broke the bread, and he gave the bread. And all of a sudden, they recognized him, and then he vanished. The gaze of the story that we have heard this morning points to the interior lives of these two men. This was not the first time Jesus had done this taking, blessing, breaking, giving. This was not the first time Jesus had done this. These stories were emerging about his life in Palestine at the time. People were aware of things, but they were still making sense of it. They were still internalizing it. And the other story you might remember would be the feeding of the multitude. When people were hungry, they'd been hearing Jesus teach from a multitude of people, and finally it was late, and the disciples said, send them home, they got to get their food. And Jesus said, you feed them. You feed them. And how are we going to do this? Well, there was a boy with how many loaves? 5. And how many fish? 2 for a multitude. Reflecting on that story, Walter Brueggemann observes these words. Jesus took, blessed, broke, and gave the bread. These are 4 decisive verbs of our sacramental existence. Jesus conducted a Eucharist, a gratitude. He demonstrated that the world is filled with abundance, and I love this phrase, and freighted with generosity. If bread is broken and shared, there is enough for all. Jesus is engaged in the sacramental, subversive reordering of public reality. It's been my joy to take students to the Holy Land. And there's that one place that many of you I know have been to called Tabgha, which is the place that's been set aside to remember that miracle. Probably not the physical land, but you don't worry about that. You're there for the meaning. And there is a mosaic on the altar of the chapel at Tabgha that I love to gather my students around. And in the mosaic, I have the students say, tell me what you see in the mosaic. And the mosaic is very simple. It's a basket, and there's loaves of bread in it, and underneath the basket are 2 fish. And I'd say, count the loaves, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I say, what question does this raise for you? And the students say, how many loaves are in the story? 5. Where's the 5th loaf? And some wise person says from the back, it's in the bottom, you can't see it. But that's not how art works. That's not how a mosaic works. The mosaic invests itself in the observer, and the observer invests in the image, and it raises a deep question. And the deeper question is, where is the 5th loaf? And there's silence, and then there's reflection, and then someone says, are we the 5th loaf? The 2 in Emmaus saw the taking, the blessing, the breaking, the giving. And what they had felt before now came home to them in the deep inner place of themselves. They were receptive to it because they were ready for it. And they went, that's us now. So these 2 awarenesses come because they are attuned to the gift of God in that moment, and the discovery that they had somewhere along the way internalized the deeper meaning of the life and presence of Jesus. I love T.S. Eliot. And one of my favorite lines is to quote T.S. Eliot. When I'm in a situation sometimes where we're missing the point, I sometimes quote my favorite line from T.S. Eliot, and it says, we had the experience, but we missed the meaning. But return to the whole text of Eliot now. There are times when we find ourselves receptive and hungry for the opportunity to discover our deepest capacities. Remember, we're staying inside of ourselves today for a moment. To look inside of what stewardship means internally to us, not outwardly to the world, but internally to us for a moment. There is an outward life of stewardship, but it begins on the inside of who we are. And sometimes I think we don't give ourselves enough credit to be worthy, or we don't feel like we have enough internal sense of ourselves to be the steward. And we miss the point. But there are those moments when we become surprised and even joyous to know that we don't always miss the meaning. In the full text from T.S. Eliot, he writes, he knew this. He writes from the 4 quartets, the dry selvages, the moments of happiness, not the sense of well-being, fruition, fulfillment, security, or affection, or even a very good dinner, but the sudden illumination. We had the experience, but we missed the meaning, and approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness. Becoming a steward And we all are that already. That's the joy of the day. But becoming a steward is claiming our innermost qualities that hold the capacity to love and then accept the invitation to see the world in terms of abundance and relationship. It is about imagining life. It is an experience that begins within us, that is attuned to the creation itself. It shapes our capacity to love and present ourselves to be loved, to wrap the world in a constant, pervasive spirit of abundance. Douglas John Hall wrote a theology for the people of North America out of concern for our relationship to the environment and our relationship to dysfunctions of human relationship with each other. And out of a concern that we have inherited a biblical interpretation of dominion over the earth that we've been given, that oftentimes gets misused, to say that it is ours to use as we wish, no matter what the cost. He says we should be looking at framing our lives as we stand in the image of God, the Imago Dei. He writes, standing within the relationship with God, the human creature reflects God's vicarious and gracious being with in its life and the others. And there's 3 dimensions of human relatedness here. The human being is being with God, who is the source of all being, and being with the human counterpart, particularly those on the margins, and then being with nature, not over, but intentionally with nature. And then he messes with all of us, and he frames it all in these words. We own nothing, but are entrusted with everything. And that reorients our whole thinking about how we experience stewardship from the inside. One of my mentors said to me years ago, and this is a sentence that I have never forgotten, and I'm very grateful for. He said, every time I learn something about myself, it costs me a relationship. Well, the two in Emmaus learned something about themselves that night, and what did it cost them? They were not core disciples, but they were certainly people curious and had captured the spirit of this person, Jesus. So maybe what it cost them that night was that they had to move from follower or as mimic to that of personal agent and internalize the message and live it more fully within the world. The relationship that we lose is often the one about how we see the world. The deed that I hold to my house, I'll speak personally. The deed I hold to my house, is the important thing that I own it, or is it that I am entrusted with it? Discipleship is stewardship, a paradigm shift the world is hungry for. Thornton Wilder, I think, says these words that lead us to fullness here. In the 3rd act of Our Town, my favorite play, he takes us to the cemetery and he points out all the graves of the people we've met in the first 2 acts to remind us that we're all headed there someday and that it's a beautiful place. But then the stage manager begins to wax about these people. He says, now there are some things we all know, but we don't take them out and look at them very often. We all know that something is eternal. And it ain't houses, and it ain't names, and it ain't earth, and it ain't even the stars. Everybody knows in their bones that something is eternal. And that something has to do with human beings. All the greatest people ever lived have been telling us that for 5,000 years, and yet you'd be surprised how many people are losing hold of it. There's something way down deep that's eternal about every human being. Taking, blessing, breaking, giving. The two from Emmaus embodied it because they had sensed the significance of it. God has bestowed it within each of us as an inherent gift of being human. The good news today is we already are there. But what pours out of us is the gift to the world. But what also pours out of us is the awareness of how God holds each of us with deep regard that was inherent in our nature, that was communicated to us in that baptism today. It's a celebration of the gift of life and the regard with which all life is held, and we embody it. And from that, our stewardship then is a reminder now and to all generations that follow. You are loved. You are loved. You the world, you the creation, you the human community, you the church, and you. Blessings and amen.